Hi, everyone. My name is Jenny, and on behalf of the Woodstock History Center, I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight's speaker is Jane Hennedy. In addition to being a site manager for two of Historic New England's properties, Jane is also an historian with 30 years of experience in preserving and purveying local history. Today, she'll be sharing some of her knowledge on the topic of ice harvesting. If you have any questions during tonight's program, please type your questions in the Zoom chat box so that Jane can address them at the end of the program. So welcome, Jane, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I am very glad to be with you virtually in Woodstock, Vermont. I want to thank everybody for joining us on this February evening. This is, ice harvesting season right now. And I want to thank everybody at the Woodstock History Center. And Jenny has been so kind to invite me and really made it easy for me to incorporate more local history into my talk because she sent me so much great information. So here we're looking at some ice harvesting at historic New England's Eustis Estate in Milton, Massachusetts in 1894. And it was a small crew who did their annual ice harvesting just as so many people did across New England as a commonplace practice. We'll go through the process from pond to icebox, through time from ancient days to today, and looking at small operations and huge industries, and talk about the importance of ice in everyday life in New England in past centuries. To start with, I work in the flatlands of coastal southern Rhode Island for Historic New England, which is the oldest and largest regional heritage organization in the nation. I work at two coastal farms, Casey Farm and Watson Farm in southern Rhode Island. And I'm lucky that I can be the site manager for these two beautiful places that together measure 565 acres. And one thing that southern Rhode Island has in common with Vermont is that both areas historically raised cows and sheep, and we still do. Both farms have some evidence of ice harvesting in the past, and I'll show you them as we go along. But Historic New England has 39 historic sites altogether, and none yet in Vermont. However, we do have several ways to enjoy Vermont's history. Members of the Henry Sheldon Museum in Middlebury get free admission to tour all historic New England properties for free, and our members can tour the Sheldon Museum for free. We've done several public programs, public history projects about Vermont history, such as a film about granges and a virtual tour app about farmers markets. Other Vermont history topics available through our website are kit houses in Burlington and one-room schoolhouses. And there are many other benefits to membership. So I encourage you to visit our website to find out more about that and to explore our Vermont collections. And of course, I encourage you to support Woodstock History Center, and I assume that you are already members there, but it seems like a wonderful place that I'm looking forward to visiting someday. So thank you for your support. And thank you if you're a member of Historic New England already. And you're lucky in Vermont that in the Woodstock area, you have other historic sites like the King Farm and the Billings Farm and Museum that interpret ice harvesting. I hope you support them too. But Old Colony History Museum in Taunton, Massachusetts is where the talk originated, and it contains a good collection about the ice industry in Taunton. And I want to thank them and former curator Jane Canberra, who wrote this talk that mine is based on in the 1990s after having gone to a demonstration by the National Ice Harvesting Club in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and learning the ice harvester's 11th commandment, Thou shalt not carelessly allow thy tools to drop to the bottom of the pond. Our topic this winter evening is the once commonplace activity of ice harvesting in New England. And most folks are not very familiar with the history of harvesting ice, but perhaps you've seen the movie Frozen that opens with ice harvesting, or perhaps you've read a chapter in Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder, which has a pretty accurate description about ice harvesting in it. And most of us are so accustomed to our electric refrigerators and freezers, we take our year-round access to cold drinks and ice cream for granted. And with electric refrigeration and all our packaged foods, we don't need to give the problem of food preservation a second thought until the power goes out. But our ancestors certainly had to think about ways to preserve food, or they never would have survived. In China, there's evidence that people were storing ice before 1100 BCE, and a cuneiform tablet records the building of an ice house in Mesopotamia in 1780 BCE. In this country, before the American Revolution, the use of ice for food preservation was not widespread, despite many deaths each summer from food poisoning. It was simply too expensive to harvest and store ice for most people but the wealthy. After the war and at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, more and more people were moving from farming in the country to factories in the city, and therefore away from ready sources of fresh food. So chilling food to make it last longer became more important than ever. So here we're looking at a spring house at Watson Farm, and this will come into our discussion of what did people do before there were ice boxes and refrigerators to preserve food. So, of course, in Vermont, I'm sure you're thinking about, that it's easy to put your food outdoors in the wintertime. You can keep it underwater. You can keep it in root cellars. Of course, there's many methods: boiling, burial, canning, pickling, drying, smoking, salting, curing, jellying, fermenting. Use of oils, vinegar, lye, spices, herbs, honey, and sugar are all preservatives. And of course, in Vermont, you know all about preserving milk by making it into cheese. So this spring house at Watson Farm has to do with cheese. It's covering a natural spring and it's built into a hillside. So with the coolness of the spring and the insulation of the earth, it created a chilled environment, but it's not really cold enough to keep milk fresh for long. And in fact, farmers in Jamestown purposely created funky cheese in this spring house from naturally occurring good bacteria, and they fed their cows turnips. So spring houses were much more common than ice houses in the 18th century, but they couldn't keep food at a consistently cold temperature. So here's some advertisements for preserved foods from the late 19th century, and you can see there was a huge variety even then. And the use of ice meant more fresh foods and less food poisoning, and less food products needed to be treated in these time-consuming ways. And some of them don't look very appetizing to me anyway. I'm not sure I would try the fluid beef. But we'll be hearing about the life of Olin Maxim from Woodstock, who was born in 1904 and whose oral history is recorded at Woodstock Historical Society. He remembered that his mother used to can beef, pork, and lots of vegetables in his childhood. And some folks never lost the knowledge of home canning as it was passed down through the generations. However, in more recent years, there's been a more widespread resurgence, you might have noticed, of interest in pickling, canning, and fermenting. And you can find them, of course, at these products at farmers markets, including one at Casey Farm where I work. We have a farmers market in the season every Saturday. At the turn of the 19th century, it was mainly the wealthy who had ice year-round, including Thomas Jefferson, who attributed his good health to soaking his feet in ice water every day. In 1801, Jefferson had an ice well built underground in what is now the West Wing of the White House. a good place to chill wine among other treats, and then had one built a year later at Monticello. George Washington's diary in 1785 included this entry, quote, "Having put in the heavy frame into my ice house, I began this day to seal it with boards and to ram straw between these boards and the wall." Unquote. It was dug 10 feet deep into a hillside for even more insulation. Even on the Potomac, enslaved people on Washington's plantation could reportedly capture floating chunks of ice in the Potomac to fill up the ice well, and then they could retrieve it for food preparation using a tall ladder. Ice was an extravagance most often used to make delicacies like ice cream that Washington and Jefferson had learned about in Europe, but also to preserve food longer. Soon, ice houses or ice cellars became more common on farms of all sizes from Virginia northward, where fresh water regularly froze solid in the winter and where there was generally abundant pure water. Vermont's wonderful resource of Lake Champlain is a prime example. And I understand that the Pogue at Mount Tom, once part of the Billings Estate and now managed by the National Park Service, was a great source for ice harvesting after an earthen dam was constructed in the 1880s. And that the old gristmill pond in Woodstock near today's rec center was also harvested year after year well into the 20th century after a wooden dam was constructed on the Ottauquechee River. And pardon me if I didn't say that correctly. Climate change, of course, means that many waters that once reliably froze solid long enough to harvest ice no longer do so today. But back in those days, harvesting ice was a community affair, also providing local residents with a chance to socialize. It meant that the snow got cleared from the ice so kids could skate or slide around it, and it was an occasion for social get-togethers and good food and drink. So as you can see in this close-up of the Currier and Ives lithograph print, which of course is an idealized look back, the basic equipment for harvesting ice was simple. Handheld saws and axes for cutting the blocks, picks for floating it, and horses and sleighs for transporting it to the ice house. Much like bringing in the hay, cutting ice was part of the agricultural year and as much work as harvesting any field crop, so it required at least a few people to help, and farmers would often team up. Some farmers considered it the first crop of the year, being harvested in January and February. Then, as the new republic grew by leaps and bounds, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, the American population boomed and the demand for ice started to increase. To meet the demand, nearly every New England town had at least one small ice harvesting operation in the 19th century. Then along came entrepreneur Frederick Tudor from Boston, who was one of the first to see the opportunity to make a big profit from ice. He soon became known as the Ice King, and his personal motto, "I have so willed it," shows that his personality suited the ice industry. The son of a wealthy attorney and prominent Boston citizen, he dropped out of school at age 13 to apprentice in a store. At age 18 in 1801, his parents sent Frederick and his brother to travel in Cuba, which gave him the idea to send New England's abundant ice to the Caribbean, when in the hot weather he missed having the cold drinks he was used to from the ice harvested at one of his father's properties. Frederick began exporting ice from New England to Point South in the first decade of the 19th century, first from his father's farm in Saugus, and then Saugus, Massachusetts, and Tudor's development of above-ground ice houses, which could store large quantities during the spring and summer, and his commissioning of the first horse-drawn ice plows would revolutionize the business, along with his single-minded pursuit of this new idea to bring the cold New England winter crop to southern climates. We'll take a closer look at those innovations in a moment. By the middle of the 19th century, the rustic winter social activity had become a whirlwind of industry in many places. Spy Pond, which is a deep kettle hole in Arlington, Massachusetts, produced an estimated 75,000 tons of ice in 1864 alone. This was one of the several Tudor Ice Company ponds in the Commonwealth, as was the famous Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. Tudor also extended his ice empire to Maine, harvesting from the Kennebec and Penobscot rivers. In New Hampshire, Tudor expanded his harvesting operations to Milton, where, starting in 1858, special ice trains daily carried up to 50 full cars to Boston. I couldn't find any references to Tudor ice operations in Vermont, and I'll be interested to hear about why you think that is. But I suspect it's because Vermont's geography made it easier to get ice to New York rather than to Boston. And of course, there were some larger commercial operations owned by others in places like Burlington and St. Albans that were linked to New York. But the most far-flung source for the Tudor Ice Company reportedly came during the mild winter of 1828, when a Tudor Ice Company ship cut part of an iceberg in Labrador to bring it to Martinique. One of Tudor's companies, Fresh Pond Ice, moved harvesting operations from Massachusetts to Brookline, New Hampshire, to get an enormous amount of ice from the pristine Lake Potanepo in the 1890s. Throughout the country in 1886, there were over 25 million tons of ice harvested. By the late 19th century, the labor of thousands of people and animals and approximately $30 million were invested in the business of harvesting, storing, and selling ice in this country. And ice was the second largest export from the United States in the middle of the 19th century. And yes, cotton was number one. As the industry became standardized around the time of the Civil War, both the commercial ice houses and many local farmers followed the same basic procedures when harvesting ice. The ice crop was harvested in January and February after the lakes, ponds, or rivers had frozen to at least 8 to 12 inches thick. If necessary, the area to be cut was cleared of snow using shovels or a horse-drawn scraper. Ole and Maxim of Woodstock used a horse team to scrape the mill pond in the 1920s. A stormy winter would cause expensive delays for the commercial ice houses, not only from the time it took to remove the snow, but the insulating properties of snow do not allow for ice to grow fast underwater. Later, tractors were adapted to become snowplows, like this one from the Fresh Pond Ice Company in Brookline, New Hampshire. Pat Burke, whose oral history was recorded by Brookline Historical Society, described how, after it snowed 5 or 6 inches, they would score the ice around it, allow the snow to sink, and let it refreeze with clean ice. But if there were only a few inches of snow, it was scraped from the ice fields into channels. Once cleared, the ice field was measured off in a grid pattern of several ice cakes, often 22 by 44 inches. This was done by using a marker plow with a swinging guide, which made 3-inch deep cuts. The swinging guide would be placed in the line previously cut to ensure that the next set would be 22 inches apart from that. And here's a great image from Woodstock Historical Society of a plow team at the mill pond ready to plow the grid pattern into the ice. The horses were equipped with spiked shoes, which you can just make out in the silhouette of the horse on the right, and so that they could trot on the ice more safely. And at least 4 inches of ice were needed to support the weight of a horse. And we will talk more about that later. After the marker plow, the horse-drawn ice plow then followed the incised lines again and cut the ice an additional 6 to 12 inches, or approximately 2/3 of the way through the depth. And you'll notice that, like the marker plow, each of the ice plow's blades are longer than the one preceding it, all the better to slice through the ice like a razor. Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, is the person who invested first in this time-saving way to cut ice, but it was his ingenious young foreman, Nathaniel Wyeth, who invented the system before 1825 when Tudor bought the patent, and it was the key to the company's success. Wyeth had been a hotel owner in Cambridge, Massachusetts before working with Tudor. In midlife, he was a trailblazer and explorer of America's West. He ended up getting a sunflower named after him, but he came back to the ice industry in Cambridge at the end of his life and made most of his fortune there. Wyeth's system was used to cut ice well into the 20th century in many places like Woodstock, but at the turn of the 20th century, power saws like the Fergus Falls rotary ice cutting machine were developed that could operate at speeds of up to 100 feet per minute while cutting through 12 inches of ice. Some were powered at first by a steam engine and then by gasoline. And it was said that one power saw could replace 5 horseplow teams. Despite the dangerous machine, apparently kids still thought that ice cutting was an invitation to have fun. Although mechanized tools could lessen the amount of time and number of people needed to harvest the ice crop, many tasks continued to be done by people with hand tools: the ice saw, ice tongs, ice gaff, and ice pick. And here you can see those tools in action at the mill pond in Woodstock. These workers are using ice picks to move the blocks along to coworkers with tongs to bring them up the ramps, whose pulleys brought the blocks up into the ice house. But whatever the harvesting method, the desired result was called black ice, a clear, clean, and bubble-free product which would take longer to melt than ice with bubbles in it. In this print of a large commercial operation, the worker on the left is holding a long ice pick, and these were variously known too as a bar or a hook or a pike. And this tool was used to float large sheets of ice from the field to an open channel. The worker in the center is using an ice saw to cut free the large sheets, which had been plowed 2/3 of the way through. And although along with chisels or bars, ice saws were used to split off individual ice cakes from the sheets. Those farmers and small operators who didn't have ice plows used ice saws for all of their cutting. And here are 2 Fresh Pond Ice Company employees showing how it was done in Brookline, New Hampshire. The cutters used a circular action to keep the saws in motion. Open channels in the water were cut to allow the ice to be pushed toward the ice house. And here we see large ice sheets being floated from the field to the open channel. At Fresh Pond Ice, one nighttime worker would drive what they called a steamboat to keep the channels open. This channel was the easiest way to move the large blocks along with pikes. Pat Burke of Brookline also describes some kids riding ice cakes down the channel sometimes. These workers are pushing the sheets closer to the ice house. The sheets would then be split into individual cakes, each weighing approximately 200 pounds. And in large commercial operations, they could weigh upwards of 300 pounds. And the cakes were fed up into the ice house by means of a fully operated conveyor belt. Though it was a somewhat smaller operation in Woodstock, you can see the same elements at work in the middle of a harvest at the mill pond. So take a look at the man with the ice pick on his precarious-looking ice bridge. He's actually supported on the right side by more ice, which has already been scraped, but he has an open channel in front of him, and he looks to be maneuvering the ice cakes toward the ramp with a pike. Across the pond, a team is sawing ice cakes while the horses are pulling a large sled to bring up into the ice house. And here's some close-ups. So it's still a little hard to see, but I think you can probably make out that the sled team is drawing a load of ice, just like Olin Maxam described as his job for about 10 years in the 1920s and 30s. He said it took about 2 weeks to fill up the ice house at the mill pond. And you can make out that the pulley at the top of the ramp, and and in this case, it probably was not yet mechanized, but they probably used people power to get it into the ice house. And there is somebody at the bottom of the ramp who's supervising the blocks as they go into the ice house. Well, this entire operation did not always go smoothly, and an obvious danger was that people and or horses would fall into the icy water. They would be pulled out as quickly as possible using ropes and planks. From a man in Jamestown, Rhode Island, his story was that it was his job when he was a kid helping ice harvesters at the local pond to make sure that a rescued horse galloped itself dry. In Gloucester, Rhode Island, there's a story that includes giving the horse some brandy to warm him up after a dunk in the pond. But from Woodstock Historical Society, we get the account of Olin Maxam, who participated in a rescue in the 1920s when he was hauling ice with a horse-drawn sled and another man was doing the plowing. Olin said, "I remember back years ago, this man had a pair of horses, a gray one and a bay one, and I don't know how I didn't see it when it happened, but I was there and one of them fell into the pond. So we got the other one out of the way and put a strap around his neck and not quite choke him, but shut his wind off a little bit. And then 3 or 4 of us pushed him right down into the water. And then when he come up to the top of the water, he came right up on top of the ice and 3, 4 of us grabbed right hold of him and pulled him right out onto the ice and get him into a barn and get him rubbed off and get some blankets on him. Zero weather." So that's a pretty harrowing story that he told in a typical laconic New England fashion. So I was talking with Jenny about this, and she thinks it may sound inhumane to cut off a horse's wind and push him back underwater, but it was actually pretty brilliant to use the air trapped in the horse's lungs to make him more buoyant and use the momentum of after you push him under a little to pop him back up and back out onto the ice. And Jenny pointed out that the horse would also be stunned and therefore safer to handle rather than a panicking animal. Olin confirmed that the horse was okay after this experience, but the other driver was fired, and Olin took over the job of plowing as well as drawing ice on a sled with his horse team. Olin also bred and showed oxen, which you can see were used at the Pogue along with horses, and either they were only used to haul the ice on solid land, or they had to make sure the ice was really thick before driving them with an ice plow. I understand there were also oxen that were used to haul the sleds at the mill pond. Well, a less exciting job for young people was Shine Boy, who cleaned up after the horses and the oxen, I guess, and poured formaldehyde on the ice in an effort to keep it more hygienic. But imagine being Shine Boy at the Pogue for the horses and oxen and all this mud, too. But perhaps the most dangerous job in the ice industry were held by the switchers. With handheld pikes, these people were responsible for routing the heavy, slippery cakes once they slid down the ramp inside the ice house. As the cakes slid in, the switchers would push them away from the chutes to their co-workers, who placed them in layers on the ice house floor. So speed was important, since at the large ice houses, 300-pound cakes could zoom in at the rate of 1 per second. In this manner, layer by layer, the ice house would be filled from floor to ceiling. And in this print, you can see that the crew pushes the cakes with pikes and lines them up like tiles on a floor. And in an ice house this large, no insulation between the cake layers was necessary because the thermal mass would keep it cold enough. And if on the very top layers, the cracks could be sealed with wax paper and topped with an insulator like straw. And they could be chiseled apart later if necessary. And there needed to be air circulation above the ice stack to keep the ice sweet, they called it, or free from mold and mildew. For easier handling and storage, it was important that all the cakes were of uniform thickness. So one of the ways to ensure that was to use a mechanical planer, which was easier to do after the invention of the gasoline engine. And you can see a big pile of ice shavings under the trestle here. You might be able to see similar piles at the mill pond in Woodstock, leading into what looks like a medium-sized ice house for its time. Commercial ice houses could be hundreds of feet long, about the size of a football field, and multi-storied. But perhaps the biggest of them all was the Fresh Pond Ice House in Brookline, New Hampshire. The switchers inside had to use a conveyance track because the place was so big. Fresh Pond Ice had 13 ice house sections built together, each 6 stories high and insulated, with then 4 additional stacks at the end. Brookline Historical Society estimated that the size was 250 feet wide by 900 feet long, and it was said to have been the largest ice house under one roof in the world. In its heyday in the early 20th century, they could store over 80,000 pounds at one time. They employed over 300 workers in the summertime, some who came up from the distribution operation in Massachusetts, some locals, and some itinerant workers, including indigenous people. Like we saw in Woodstock, inexpensive softwoods, like hemlock, spruce, and white pine were used to build most New England ice houses, such as this little one with a ventilated roof on Long Island in Boston Harbor. The salt marsh hay provided good insulation over the top of the ice, and it was a good way to keep the day's catch fresh. Small farms, especially dairies, benefited from small ice storage houses on their properties because their products could stay fresh longer and both could be delivered together. This shingled ice house at King Farm was used for keeping milk cold and also for supplying the kitchen ice box. The last king to own the farm, Francesca King Thomas, who was born in 1898, remembered splitting ice from 400-pound blocks into smaller pieces that she could carry into the house. Sometimes ice houses were painted white, like this one, or whitewashed to reflect the summer sun. Or how about this fancy pink Gothic revival one at another Woodstock, Connecticut, where Roseland Cottage is. If stored correctly in the winter, there was enough ice for all the summertime parties once held at Roseland Cottage. Non-heat conducting materials like sawdust or straw were used between an inner and outer wall of the ice house for insulation. Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, said that sawdust was the best insulator, or rather, the inventor of above-ground ice houses, his foreman Nathaniel Wyeth, figured that out. Additional sawdust or straw was often packed around the stored ice, which is a good reason why rural ice businesses were often paired with sawmills and with farms. At Casey Farm, where I work, the ice house or root cellar was built into a little hill to take advantage of the natural insulation of the earth, as you can see in this image from about 1878. So today there's the root cellar is still there, but a carriage house has been built on top of it. For industrial ice production, a good way to move the blocks to customers was the railroad. Fresh Pond Ice had 75 special ice trains for 75 special ice train cars for transport to Cambridge and Somerville, Massachusetts. They would cut the ice from the lake and load it directly into the cars for the first cutting of the winter. Using train lines, ice storage facilities, even in the deep south, were able to have the benefits of cold storage from New England water sources. A good ice storage facility could keep ice frozen through the warm weather months until it was time to harvest ice again. And I have an illustration to show the surprising durability of the stored ice. This mountain of ice is from the aptly named Mountain Ice Company of New Jersey. This is what was left after a July 1912 fire. The remaining pile was 50 feet high. It took several weeks in the hot summer sun for this ice to melt completely. Fire was always a problem at the wooden ice houses filled with combustible sawdust and straw, as was the occasional collapse under the weight of the ice. For these reasons and obsolescence, few ice houses remain. And that was the fate of the largest contiguous ice house in the world at Brookline, New Hampshire. The business suffered in the 1930s, so there were few employees left, but the whole place went up in flames on March 22nd, 1935. The ice house at the Mill Pond in Woodstock met with a different but no less destructive fate. Harry Ambrose described it in his memoir, The Horse's Mouth. Ice was harvested every winter from the mill pond behind the old wooden dam across the Ottauquechee River near where the recreation center is. The ice took the log and plank dam out one spring shortly after World War II, but not before most of us had electric Frigidaires. So after the dam had been washed away by the ice, the old ice house probably became completely obsolete and collapsed. But I wonder if any of you know more about what happened to it. American ice as a commercial product was not only valued in the United States. Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, transported his ice by ship to Charleston and New Orleans in the early 19th century, but Tudor had an even bolder idea to export the products of the New England winter to India, Singapore, and the West Indies when he was 24 years old. No vessel in Boston could be hired for what seemed such a foolish venture, so Frederick spent $5,000 to build his own ship. In February of 1806, the Boston Gazette reported, "No joke, a vessel has cleared at the custom house for Martinique with a cargo of ice. We hope this will not prove a slippery speculation." At first, people in the tropics needed to be introduced to the product because very few had experienced an ice-cold drink before, so Tudor would give away free samples. He did end up selling what little ice that didn't melt on his first 3-week voyage, but he would have sold more if he had not held on to the cargo, waiting for more money. His market was cafes and wealthy people and plantation owners using the labor of enslaved people who wanted to enjoy cold drinks and desserts like ice cream. Tudor complained that no one followed his instructions for ice storage, which was basically to cover it in a container, and his early voyages failed. Tudor's own design for a transport ship with a wide bow might have kept ice frozen longer, except it wasn't seaworthy. So he had some real trouble at the beginning of his career. But his real talent was as a salesman, convincing people they needed this product. He created a market for them. And sharing Wyeth's instructions for building an above-ground ice house, he went on to be very successful selling ice in places where there were British and American colonizers, like in Havana and Calcutta, but eventually all over the world, as you can see on this map. Residents of Calcutta crowdsourced the funding of their own large and fancy ice house for Tudor products in the mid-19th century. Writer and philosopher Henry David Thoreau, watching a crew of Tudor ice cutters at Walden Pond in the winter of 1846 to 47, recorded these remarks in his journal. The sweltering inhabitants of Charleston and New Orleans, of Madras and Bombay and Calcutta, drink at my well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges. Tudor was also an author of sorts. He wrote an Ice House Diary beginning in 1805 at the start of his career and began with this gem. He who gives back at the first repulse and without striking the second blow despairs of success, has never been, is not, and never will be a hero in war, love, or business. Tudor did have a couple of stints in debtor's prison, as I mentioned, from his early missteps and bad luck, but he never gave up on his venture and ended up making a fortune by mid-century as technology improved with Nathaniel Wyeth's methods. So toward the end of his Ice House Diary, Frederick gloated, "The frost covers the windows, the wheels creak, the boys run, winter rules, and $50,000 worth of ice floats for me upon fresh pond." It seems incredible now, but some ice was considered so pure that it became a luxury item overseas, even in places that could harvest their own ice. Ice from Wenham Lake on the north shore of Massachusetts had a royal warrant from Queen Victoria and was sold all over England and Ireland. Remember, the more pure the ice, the slower it melts. Soon, Mrs. Beeton, the famous cookbook author, created a cocktail made with Wenham Lake ice, the pineapple julep. As industrialization grew, the natural ice industry gave way to the artificial ice industry, or mechanized ice. This 1890s trade journal helped to spread the news about advances in the field. As industrialization grew, so did pollution of the waterways, and as early as the 1880s, it was recognized that artificial ice was often more sanitary. Production techniques eventually brought costs lower than that of natural ice, and especially in the South, artificial ice was preferred. At an ice plant like this one in El Paso, Texas, it could produce as much as 50 tons of ice a day. Electric freezers were patented many years before by Florida resident John Gorey in 1851, but he was not taken seriously during his lifetime. Frederick Tudor, for example, considered the idea of mechanized ice to be ridiculous and never would convert his business from natural harvesting. So Frederick died in 1864 as one of the country's first multimillionaires. Frederick had married Euphemia Fenno of New York in 1834. The couple lived in Boston, where Effie hosted meetings in support of women's suffrage and became a leader in the movement in Massachusetts. The couple had 4 children who lived to adulthood. Their oldest, Frederick Jr., became an engineer who invented improvements to steam and hot water heaters, just the opposite of his father. After Effie was widowed, she moved to Newbury, Vermont, northeast of Woodstock in Orange County, where she died in 1884. One last Tudor family tie to Vermont is Effie and Frederick's great-granddaughter, Tasha Tudor, the children's book illustrator and cookbook author who famously lived in Marlborough, Vermont, as if she were born in Frederick's time. In the reproduction antique house she called Corgi Cottage, she practiced many 19th century skills like putting up the harvest for the winter, although she did own an electric refrigerator hidden away in a pantry. For many years in the North, except for the occasional warm winter, natural ice continued to be a viable and relatively inexpensive product well into the 20th century. Harry Ambrose wrote about Woodstock into the mid-1940s, and here we are showing you some images of an ice delivery company that started decades earlier. But Harry Ambrose wrote about the early 20th century. We still had an ice box. Ice was harvested every winter from the mill pond behind the old wooden dam across the Ottauquechee River near where the recreation center is. It was hard work, wet and cold, for the men cutting the thick ice with long and heavy saws. fishing the large blocks from the freezing river with tongs and loading them on wooden sleds pulled by oxen to be taken and packed away in sawdust in the ice house. The ice truck delivered door to door. So this apparently there were two ice and wood delivery companies in the 1916 Woodstock City Directory, C.M. White shown here, and the Woodstock Ice Supply Company. In the city of Taunton, Massachusetts, here is another ice delivery wagon that owned by Charles D. Peirce. Peirce established his ice and wood cutting business in 1896. Mr. Peirce ran from 6 to 8 ice teams in the city during the summer delivery season. His grandson told me that in the summer, it was not only delivery season, but that the ponds needed to be maintained during the warmer months. If the vegetation was not cut back, it made a good habitat for the muskrats who burrow into the banks, and they would swim beneath the water as it froze and ruin the product. Pat Burke recounted how the small summer workforce would clean and repair the ice houses in Brookline to get them ready for the next season, and I'm sure it was similar at many ice harvesting operations. Coursey Brothers Ice Company of Taunton was founded in the early 20th century by 3 brothers who operated 2 ice houses on the lakes nearby. This ice house had a total capacity of 8,000 tons in multiple rooms. The building's inner and outer walls were insulated with sawdust, and 4 feet of straw was placed on top. During World War II, like many industries, Coursey Brothers experienced a labor shortage. They came up with a creative solution. 35 Catholic brothers and from La Salette Shrine in Attleboro, Massachusetts, were brought in to assist. So late spring marked the beginning of the 7-month ice delivery service for the Courseys. Until 1929, 4 double-team wagons would arrive at the ice house early in the morning. Using a tool similar to this floor shaver, the Courseys would separate and push the 200-pound blocks from the back of the building to the front and load them into wagons for the icemen to deliver. And this was their multi-purpose tool. And there were many delivery companies dotted throughout New England, often paired with wood, coal, milk, or produce delivery. And I'm sure the delivery person's everyday experiences were similar. Once they reached their first stop, they would walk behind the wagons to save time for the rest of the route. Mr. Coursey said, "Those horses knew the routes better than the men." Here's an ad for the delivery of fresh pond ice in Boston. Like many other companies, Fresh Pond Ice issued rectangular cardboard signs to their customers to display in their front windows. The ice delivery person would arrive and check the position of the card, which corresponded to how many pounds of ice they wanted, usually 25 or 50 pounds. Ice scales were used at the ice house and were also on every wagon, but the mark of a good ice delivery person was the ability to cut off the right size within a pound or two without weighing it. By doing some on-the-spot calculations, the iceman or icewoman, like these two from 1918, could estimate the size of the block to be delivered. Placing the block in a leather sling or using ice tongs, he or she carried it into the house. Meanwhile, what fun it was for kids to steal a piece of refreshing ice from the back of the wagon on a hot summer day. Harry Ambrose remembered from his childhood in the 1930s and 40s. He said ice was sold by the pound, and the large blocks being chipped into small chunks to fit the customer's ice box. On hot summer days, we boys swarmed over the tailgate after the chips and slivers of cold ice to chew and suck on and quench our thirst, or crack a tooth. Ice deliveries were requested 1 or 2 times a week for most households, so the ice delivery wagon was a frequent visitor in any given neighborhood. The destination for the block of ice inside the kitchen, or often a porch, was the ice box. The reference to poison will become clear in a moment. So before the invention of, so here's a 1930s ice box where you can see the that the ice is in the top because the cold, of course, would settle downward. Um, and I would note too that many people called these refrigerators at the times just to keep it confusing. And just today, earlier today, I saw this early invention from 100 years earlier in 1830s wine cooler sideboard. So the curator said that this particular style of furniture didn't really catch on, but you can see she lifted the side and showed us there's a lead-lined box in there for the storage of a big chunk of ice and to cool the wine down. And that's the way that people stored ice before the invention of the ice box. They would keep it in a covered box or a container. And here's the inside of an oak ice box made in Arlington, Vermont, and it's owned in Rehoboth, Massachusetts. And now it's used, I understand, to store wine. But back in the day, of course, it was ice boxes were first made in the 1830s, and they were lined with galvanized metal like this one, or they were lined with wood, tile, or slate, and they were insulated with anything from mineral wool to charcoal, cork, or flax straw fibers. Dense woods like oak and mahogany were frequently the choice for cabinet materials, and we see this fancy mahogany one in historic New England's Phillips House in Salem, Massachusetts. This one is iced from the outside, and the ice went in the top because, as I mentioned, cold settles downward, and then a rubber tube would route the dripping water into a pan under the ice box that needed to be emptied. And sometimes that was a job for a child or, in the Phillips case, a servant. And I understand that in northern New England, ice chests would often be found outside on the porch for easy access by the ice delivery service, and less fuss when the ice melted. Here's an ice-chilled picnic refrigerator lunchbox from 1939 on the right. On the left, especially for dairies, Woodstock Electric Company offered Frigidaire milk coolers that used flowing cold water to cool fresh cans of milk. So they had gone from cooling with ice to cooling with electricity at that point. But once the ice was in the home, the family needed some tools to move and chip ice. And these look a little bit like overkill from the Phillips house, but that was a well-to-do house with servants to work at big parties. Or to delay melting, use your ice blanket. The average household at the height of the ice harvesting industry used about 3,000 pounds of ice annually. But at Phillips House, they ordered more than 1,600 pounds of ice just for the month of June 1919. By the first decade of the 20th century, plentiful ice meant an explosion of chilled and frozen desserts at home, like these sherbets and ice creams from the Hood Company. Today, one of the few uses that we see for large blocks of ice, which are almost all made artificially, are ice sculptures. For a special event, they make quite a beautiful sight, and they might also chill your shrimp or vodka. Or how about visiting Grafton or Stowe next January for the impressive ice sculptures and winter festivals? You can still find some ice cutting demonstrations in the Midwest, Canada, and northern New England, such as at the Thompson Ice Harvesting Museum in South Bristol, Maine. And their ice harvesting demonstration is this Saturday, the 22nd, from 11 to 3 p.m., so you could still make it. But it's extremely rare to find a place like Rocky Wold Deep Haven Camp on Squam Lake in Holderness, New Hampshire, that harvest ice every year for use in their cabin's ice boxes all the way until September. So I encourage you to visit all these websites that have a great history and videos. But of course, the days of the natural ice industry were really numbered with the growing popularity of the electric refrigerator. The first model General Electric monitor top was invented by engineer Christian Steenstrup in 1927. It was considered the first affordable and compact refrigeration unit for home use. Unfortunately, this generation of fridges was cooled with poisonous chemicals like sulfur dioxide, which the ice industry advocates used against them in advertising. I enjoyed learning that um, there were communal electric freezers available to rent in Woodstock, especially for freezing meats or preserving your victory garden before the days when fridges in individual homes were not a given, or if you needed to freeze large quantities. The use of safer Freon and increasing consumer power in the mid-20th century really did the old icebox in, and electric refrigerators were in most kitchens by the 1950s. But thanks to today's kitchen designers, you can get oak panels to cover your modern refrigerator to make it look like a vintage icebox. And you can eat your ice cream any time of the year and reflect how fortunate we are to have so many choices for our meals, thanks to modern conveniences. So I want to thank you very much for coming with me on this little ice harvesting journey.
Thank you very much, both Jane, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us this evening. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.